background, or were they really about political networks? Who was close to the party, who was in the youth league, who was on the way to becoming a party member, who was a student cadre? And I found that as I started reading the material about how the movement unfolded in various universities, I wasn't finding what I was supposed to find. I was finding that the students who led different factions were actually both from identical backgrounds and mostly from elite backgrounds. In fact, what I found was that the first stages of the Cultural Revolution split those people who were either part of the power structure of universities or were very close to it. I found that the grievances that were expressed had very little to do with who people were before the Cultural Revolution, but with decisions they made in the first phases of this period. And I'll explain more about that. In other words, I began to realize that we had never thought about the way that this campaign, which started from the top, forced people to make choices. People had to make a choice. And we always assumed, well, people would always make a choice depending, well, let's see, do I have a high GPA and is my father a capitalist? Well, then that means my choice in this movement is pretty clear. It turned out if you studied how the movement unfolded, it wasn't at all clear what you should do. And I'll elaborate that a little bit more later. Let me give you an example. The way that this movement, this campaign started in every single unit throughout the country was that somebody made an accusation against the top leader of your unit. They made an accusation that this person actually was a traitor to Chairman Mao's line. Now, when that happens, everybody in that unit has to make a choice. Is that attack legitimate or is it not? Does that attack represent following Mao's revolutionary line? Is that person really a traitor? Or is the person that made that accusation a hidden class enemy trying to use the Cultural Revolution to disrupt Mao's campaign? Now that's a hard choice to make. And there's two different ways of thinking about that choice. One is strategic. That is, you have to calculate, if you are close to that person, okay, if you are well known to be a close follower, as a lot of the Red Guard denunciations said, the Hongren, this person's Hongren, which I don't know how to translate, kind of like favorite, this person's favorite, fair-haired boy, I guess you would say. If you're known to be close to that person, what are you going to do? Well, you have to think about this, right? Because if it turns out it is decided in that unit that person is a traitor to Chairman Mao, where does that leave you? You're close to that person. You must be part of that person's underground anti-party organization. So you have to decide, and you have to decide pretty quickly, whether you're going to leap up and defend that leader, or whether you're going to remain silent, or whether you're going to turn around and attack that leader. Now, the more likely it appears that person's going down, the stronger your incentives are to attack that person and draw a clear line. And anyone who studied this period knows that when someone's attacked and you don't want to get caught up in that, they call hua jing jie xian. Draw a clear line between yourself. And this happened even between husband and wife. But if you are a political activist, you're someone in your school or in your, as we'll see, in your government office, you have to think very carefully. You have to think very carefully about what you're going to do. And the answer is not clear. So in the strategic sense, it depends on what will happen. What's that person's likelihood of surviving? Okay. The second half, and I don't want this argument to be caricatured as a rational choice argument, even though you do have to think, there's also the question of right and wrong. There's a question of right and wrong. It's ambiguous. What's right and what's wrong? Let's just think about, let's fictionalize this person, and it's not the economist rational calculating individual, but maybe the historians or the sociologists, highly socialized person who just wants to do the right thing. And so you're going to sit here and think through, well, they're making these accusations against this person. Could this possibly be true? Was this person deceiving me? What's a loyal party member supposed to do? Chairman Mao said that there are traitors all throughout the party in high positions. What am I supposed to do? Well, there's no clear answer to that, okay? So the party organizations and the youth league organizations and the student leaders that I was studying and members of the university staff had to make a choice. And it's not surprising that people with exactly the same backgrounds made different choices, because there's nothing to tell you based on your rank or your party membership or whether you're a student cadre and a favorite of the administration. There's nothing about that under this circumstance that helps you make that choice. And so I realized, I stopped being puzzled about the fact that you had people from identical elite backgrounds leading both factions in the schools, because it made sense given the difficult and ambiguous and rapidly changing and uncertain circumstances that people faced early in the Cultural Revolution, 1966. But once you made your choice, that identified you for the rest of the movement. If you decided to attack that leader, you became part of the so-called rebel faction. If you decided that the charges were bogus and you wanted to protect him, you became a member of another faction. And people coalesced, and they began to argue with each other. They began to fight over territory. And these cleavages became real. And they're based not on who you were or who your parents were, but what decisions you made about the movement in your unit. I also found, when I looked at how these factions later evolved, they really didn't express the kind of doctrinal differences that we expected. They usually made exactly the same accusations against one another. They were fighting over who the rebels were. Who's a rebel? Who's a real rebel in this unit? And they would argue, and they would write essays in great detail. It's amazing, actually, to think. We were trained for so long to think of Chinese studies in the 70s and 80s as a field that had to thrive somehow without sources. I don't think there's a student movement anywhere in history that wrote more about what they were doing at the time than the Red Guard movement in China's universities. It's unbelievable. These students classes were canceled, and something that I never realized, they kept the dormitories open and the food services going through the summer vacation and for 2 years, even though classes weren't meeting. And that's really, I'd never realized that, but the students were there and they were writing. Every faction, they were writing. They all published their own newspapers. They would write these long essays, which if you weren't interested in the subject deeply like me, it would be incredibly boring and formulaic, but there's lots of information. They were writing term papers about why they were right and why the other side was wrong. So you have these arguments from both sides, and they're not expressing differences about the status quo. They're making the same accusations against one another and talking about little differences in things that people did at various points in time. Sometimes it's cadre, it's the party secretary versus one of the vice party secretaries that they prefer or they think are the real. I mean, very minute differences. So both sides charged the other side with being conservatives. Both sides tried to recruit leaders to their side as the movement developed. So in other words, the major assumptions, all the key assumptions of this highly coherent explanation that I gave you at the beginning of this talk fell apart as I actually looked at the evidence. But there's more, and I want to focus more on the implications of something that I stumbled across. It seems to be my career. In my career, when I start a project, I start out with ideas that I think are pretty clear, and very quickly I find that these are very stupid ideas, and I give them up very quickly. I often end up falling over the main conclusions. This is from the time I did my dissertation. I remember I had a beautifully prepared dissertation prospectus, which I defended in front of my distinguished committee. The first time I actually interviewed a Chinese worker, I took that prospectus and threw it in the trash, because I realized after talking to that worker, I had no clue what life in a Chinese factory was actually like. This is not quite so extreme a story, but I noticed I kept bumping into something I hadn't expected to find in my various research projects. In this book, which is available on Amazon.com for $31, I've followed the story of the Beijing student movement and the factions among university students up through January of 1967, and the factions reformed at that point in time. And the reason for the factions reforming was they tried to seize power in government organizations. the reason why that led to new splits was when they got to those government offices in Beijing, they found that the people who worked in that ministry or bureau office had already divided into two factions and were vying to seize power within their ministry or within their bureau. And so the students, when they got there, if they wanted to seize power, they had to link up with one of those two factions. They'd listen to their stories about why they were right or wrong, and then make a connection with them. Well, the students from the Aeronautics Institute would go and ally themselves with Faction A, and Faction A would say, okay, we're the revolutionary left and we will seize power. And the students from the Geology Institute would go and align with Faction B and say, no, we're seizing power, these guys are right. And so pretty soon the people at Beida, Tsinghua, and the Aeronautics Institute were fighting against another coalition led by the Geology Institute and Beijing Normal University. And they ended up forming two factions, because when they tried to seize power in the government units, those cadres were already mobilized and fighting among one another. Well, you know, if our model is that the masses are rising up and trying to attack the state, and that's our explanation for why the state collapses, what on earth are all the state officials doing, being fully mobilized and arguing among themselves? There's something going on within the state structure that's very important. And we had never really thought about it. In fact, I began to think maybe this is the key to why the state itself collapsed so quickly. The second time I ran over this, I kept running into this, was in the work that I'm doing with Professor Dong at Nanjing University about how the conflict played out in Nanjing. And when it came time for the power seizure in Nanjing in January of 1967, exactly the same thing happened. The workers and students, first they would go to take over the newspaper, the provincial newspaper, and they would be met with the rebel group from within the newspaper. Then they go to the radio station. They would link up with the rebel group within the radio station. Then they would go and take over the provincial or the municipal party committee, and the rebel group from within the Jiguan, the office staff of the government and party had already mobilized. They would link up with them and seize power. And in fact, you couldn't seize power and run anything unless you had a lot of cadres on your side who knew how to turn on and off switches, where the keys were, and so forth, how to put out a newspaper, how to run the radio operation. But this really, so again, we see that cadres in the state structure itself were already mobilized and fighting with one another. What really nailed this home, when I finally realized, I've been hit twice in the head, I still didn't realize what I'd seen. I was in a relatively remote county interviewing some retired officials. I was there actually as a spouse, and I had nothing to do, so I decided to talk to some retired cadres that I'd met 20 years before about what they did, what happened in the county during the Cultural Revolution. They were very excited. They were very excited. If you want to interview people in China, interview the retired officials, because they've got plenty of time. They got plenty of time, and they don't care what the implications are, what they tell you, really. Whereas if you're still on your job and you start talking about things that are going on, it could come back and get you, right? Plus, you're very, very, very busy. And I realized, as one old timer after another said, "Oh, yeah, I was in this faction, and oh, my friend, he was later the head of the Agricultural Bureau. He's now retired, but he was on the other faction, and we really didn't agree with each other." And they started introducing me to all their friends who were in different factions. I realized, was there any official in this county that wasn't deeply involved in this political movement? And then I realized there were no university students in this county. There was only one high school in this entire county, had 700,000 people. And one high school had about 200 students. So there really wasn't much of a Red Guard movement. There were no factories in this county. They had maybe 300 workers. The only people in this county who really cared about the Cultural Revolution were the cadres. So this movement in this relatively remote county was very active, and the cadres were all involved and were fighting one another. They told me actually quite a number of quite scary stories about how this continued over several year periods. So If we want to get to an answer for the question, how did this supposedly incredibly disciplined and unified state structure collapse so quickly, there's something going on within the state apparatus itself. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about, on a national level, a state structure that had roughly 10 to 11 million cadres in it in 1966. Party membership of around 27, 28 million. That's a lot of people. There were 600,000 college students in China in 1966, and we've been focusing on that group as if it had this huge, huge impact. There were a lot more workers. There were 3 million high school students at the time. But this is a very large group, except for industrial workers and, of course, farmers who weren't that involved in this dimension of the movement. This is a very large group. Secondly, these people are politically connected. They are the most politically connected people. They had the most to gain and the most to lose from this movement. And cadres, the government offices were everywhere, okay? Right down to the county level and township level. There were state employees. And this is, so you might say, well, okay, but aren't all states like this? That's true, but there are some fairly peculiar features to this state. First of all, to be a government official in this country at this point in time is really the only decent job, except maybe if you're a scientist or an engineer, which in the Cultural Revolution wasn't a great job to have anyway. The best positions are government positions. There's no exit. You can't xiaohai. You can't go and teach. You can't become a consultant. You can't leave and go into the private sector. There's no private sector. This is all there is. And the only way to leave is in disgrace. And leaving just doesn't mean you lose your perks. That means you made a mistake. So the punishments could be quite severe. And this made me realize that when you talk about a highly disciplined and unified state structure like China's during this period, we usually think of dictatorships as repressing ordinary citizens, which of course is true. But the repression is really focused on government officials. Government officials are watched very, very closely for what they say, what they do, and in the Mao period, they're constantly being watched for signs of disloyalty and constantly being forced in these political campaigns to make decisions. And in a way, and I know this is a big debate within China, to the extent that people debate who were the victims of the Cultural Revolution in China. It bothers a lot of pro-democracy activists to hear this said, but the fact is that government officials were victimized, among the biggest victims in the Cultural Revolution. People in the elite at that time they were victimized at very, very high rates. And I know people don't want to hear this, but it's absolutely true. And the characteristic of this regime at that time, which is not characteristic of it today, is that people in these positions of authority and privilege are also subject to repression. And that is what makes it so vulnerable to flipping from being monolithic, highly disciplined, to tearing itself apart. And so to trace this out a little bit further in the time remaining, basically officials in this structure are highly attentive to signals from above, and they get it from not only the official newspapers, the Cancao Xiaoxi, the Neibu Cancao, and the government documents, which they study very, very carefully. One of the things that we've been able to do with Professor Dong at Nanjing University, he's got the notebooks of a man who's the head of the Communist Youth League organization for the province of Jiangsu. And this man carefully wrote out all the government documents. And it was very clear he was trying to memorize what was the right thing to do and what was the wrong thing to do. It's very interesting to read these notebooks. When the signals from above are clear, this structure is highly unified. It acts with unity. Anyone steps out of line gets it, okay? But in the Cultural Revolution, all of this was turned upside down. Mao and the people at the top are saying, doubt the people who are at the head of your organizations. Attack them and we support you. And Mao's attitude was, hey, just let it fly. Let it fly. people told him the whole thing could come about, and Mao said, well, maybe it's a good thing. If you think about a hypothetical government organization which has 100 people working for it, in the beginning, maybe the top 5 officials, the party committee of that unit, are potentially the main targets of the unit. Everyone else has to decide, as I said earlier, what their attitude is going to be when the accusations start flying. And in some of the material that we have from the early period, what officials do is they start, on the party committee, will start attacking one another. They see what's coming down the road, and they know someone's got to go down, and so they stand up and attack someone next to them on the party committee, who in turn may attack them, which forces everyone to take sides. Now, what I'm working on now, my current research project, one of the things we're doing is we're taking accounts of what happened from 66 to actually 71 in every county level jurisdiction, city level jurisdiction in China from county annals, 县志 and 市志. And we're looking at when things happened. And one of the things we're finding so far is, one of the things we're looking at is how quickly did this movement spread? How quickly did power seizures spread? When you have a power seizure in a unit, that means that the civilian government has fallen. Or, as they typically say in these annals, in the Dashiji section or the politics section, they'll use the term paralyzed, 瘫痪. The government no longer functions. Now what's amazing is that we actually have these accounts for 2,280 of the 2,300 or so. There's only 17 county level jurisdictions we don't have this information for. And so far in 95% of these units, the government, civilian government, has fallen according to this definition within a 3-week period of the Shanghai government falling in early January. It's as if this thing happened instantaneously. And there's no relationship between this collapse and the amount of public protest that's reported in these same annals. There's no relationship. It's as if an electrical shock went through the government's structure right down to the grassroots, outpacing the ability of the population to mobilize. And this speed is unrelated to, we also have, these county annals are actually wonderful sources of data if you have the 20 years and tenure to work on a project like this. We know how many party members there are, how many cadres there are, how many workers there are in these counties for about 92% of these places. Totally unrelated to the social structure of these units, how urbanized, how rural. Things are transmitted right down through the party and state organization because officials themselves are taking the initiative. And after this happens in early 67, fighting goes on for almost another 2 years. But what you see in most of the places where we have enough detail to be able to piece this together is you have different factions led by different groups of officials who are leading mass groups and vying to reconstitute the government that's just fallen apart. So how has this picture of mass politics in this period in China changed? In the course, I said, comrades, the past is always changing. This is what I mean. Our image of mass protest as overwhelming a state targeted by aggrieved social groups from below is obviously inaccurate. It's very hard to talk about cadres who were the elite in this system being aggrieved and attacking the state itself. The idea that political interests are driven by individuals' positions prior to the Cultural Revolution seems largely erroneous or irrelevant to this story. Interests are driven by forced choices early in the Cultural Revolution that become real and become people's motives to defend them in the next stage. The idea that factions represent different social groups with different levels of vested interests is also not applicable to this story at all. Groups usually split individuals from the same background who made different choices in these ambiguous situations. And again, this is the other feature of this is losing in this political system at this point in time is a catastrophe for you personally. You're not just going to lose your job, but it became very clear as these fights became more violent, you could lose your life, or if they achieve power and they're calling you a counter-revolutionary, you know what the penalty for counter-revolutionary is. So the exit from this political system, it's not like students in the Berkeley student movement who could transfer to Stanford. You're not going to transfer to Sonoma State. You're not going anywhere in China without your past catching up with you at this point in time. So does this mean that the sociology of